Good morning. I was asked to chair the current session in the physical absence of Dr. Miriam Ophir, who's with us on Zoom. I'm delighted she could join us on Zoom, and we enjoy her ongoing work with us, whether on Zoom or in person. Thank you, Miriam. We have students with us, and one of the stated goals of the Lancet Commission is to have a historically informed professional identity. And I think what we're going to experience right now is a testament to why history matters. This session is unique in its presence of graduates from Ben-Gurion University and faculty from Ben-Gurion University. Last night, you met my mentor and my friend, Professor Bill Zeidelman, who's an emeritus professor at Ben-Gurion University. And we're honored to have the Vice Dean of the Medical School with us here today, Professor Ilan Shelef. And Ben-Gurion University made a landmark decision in terms of its teaching of the curriculum that we're working to develop a year ago by being the first medical school in the world to make the course matter of medicine and the Holocaust a core curriculum subject for all medical students. And it is a tribute, I think, to the efforts of Dr. Ilan Shelef, who's the Vice Dean of the Medical School, and other faculty who are very engaged in the matter, including the faculty we're going to meet in this session. And the reason I say that history matters is because the faculty in Beersheva was founded by Professor Moshe Privas. Moshe Privas was a graduate of the Warsaw Medical School in 1939. And you will find a case study on him in Dr. Tessa Schluss's book, in which he was the leader of the Jewish Students' Union in the Warsaw Medical School, when a decree was made by the dean of the medical school that Jewish students were to sit on separate benches. And when they were to submit their tests, they were going to submit their tests marked with their Jewish identity. Moshe Privas, as the leader of the student union, led a resistance that was a passive resistance of protest, in which the students that were Jewish did not sit on those benches, but rather stood for the entire lectures on the side in protest of this discriminatory actions. He later moved to Israel and established the university in Ben-Gurion. He was the first president of Ben-Gurion University and the first dean of the medical school, with a vision of a physician that I very much think the Lancet Commission has in mind, which is both historically informed and seeing the patient in a holistic manner, the entire patient and the entire person, and their identity and their settings in the community. So with that historical background, I want to present our first two speakers on this session. The first is Professor Nadav Davidovich, who's an epidemiologist and an expert in public health. He is the director of the Ben-Gurion University School of Public Health. In addition, he serves as the chair of the Association for Public Health in Israel and the Israeli representative to the Executive Committee on European Public Health Association. His areas of research include health policy, public health history, ethics, and sociology of health. And since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, he has advised various government agencies in Israel and abroad on the need for structural change in the health system, with an emphasis on social issues and addressing health inequities. He gives an annual lecture in the course on medicine and the Holocaust, which is one of the most thought-provoking lectures in the course, where he brings it home for the students in terms of the Israeli context of where this history informs our practice in Israel, with some of the more controversial bioethic dilemmas that are facing and have faced Israeli physicians. With him, we'll be presenting Dr. Hagai Boaz, who is a medical sociologist specializing in bioethics. He writes on and researches the topics of organ donations, vaccinations, and public health policies. He has co-edited the book Bioethics and Biopolitics in Israel, and his upcoming book, due for publication at the end of the year, The Political Economy of Organ Transplants, Where Do Organs Come From? He is currently the head of the Division on Science, Technology, and Society at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, and is an adjunct senior lecturer at the Department of Politics and Governance at Ben-Gurion University in the Negev. Professor Davidovich and Hagai Boaz, please.
Wow, it's very exciting to be here. I'm also very proud of the Ben-Gurion University presence, that Ilan is here with us, and also very familiar faces. You're doing, the Lancet Commission is doing such an important work, and Shani, I'm so proud that you are the student that is organizing it. Just a brief context of what we're going to present. So this was part of an edited volume that emerged from a workshop we had in Villa Vanze. It was very crazy to sit there and having this workshop. The workshop actually was about the shadow of the Holocaust, or even more so Nazi medicine, on the development of bioethics in Israel and Germany. Since then, we won a grant from Lower Saxony. So Professor Silke Shiktan, she is the director of the Center for History of Medicine and Bioethics in Göttingen. So Hagai is also part of that. Professor Volker Relke will be part of that. It was and will be part of that. Also Dr. Kefet Zalashik, that she's now in Germany. And Professor Danny Filk, also from Ben-Gurion University, from Politics and Government. So Hagai will start, and then I'll try to bring it also to the issue of medical education. And in some ways, I think it's also in a dialogue with the previous presentation. So yes, we want to bring in also history of public health, and yes, bringing it also to current issues. So we are going to play the Nazi card, but in a certain way, because you can play the Nazi card in a very bad way, and you can do it in a different way. So Hagai, and then I'll continue.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting us here. It's it's honor. So the bioethicist Arthur Kaplan argues that using the Nazi analogy to disqualify an argument is equivalent to dropping a nuclear bomb in ethical battles about science and medicine. We want to argue that this is not correct, that totally excluding the Nazi card and drawing a solid, insurmountable line between current practice and Nazi practice is equally problematic. The Nazi card is necessarily not a rhetorical move to win a discussion, but rather to emphasize that public health, and this will be the field that we focus on, public health ethics are always embedded in the political. We argue that in some cases, playing the Nazi card, namely seeing a continuity between current and pre-war or World War II medical and public health practices, discloses the inherent tension that reached a radical peak in Nazi Germany, but still exists in contemporary medicine and public health. There is an inherent tension between contradictory trends in public health. One is inclusive and focuses on in-group sentiments, and the other is exclusionary and focuses on out-group politics. National Socialism represented the radicalization of these two trends. And although we tend to reject the idea that some of our contemporary medical practice share common grounds with the medical or with the medicine practice back then, we think that it is necessarily to shed light on the differences and the similarities between the history and the present. So as Nadav said, I will present part of the theoretical background to our discussion, and Nadav will be more precise on the Israeli context. So this is the paper that if some of you want to read it, please write us and we'll send it. And I want to start with the paradox of the Holocaust in bioethics. And as you can see, from your right is the picture that I'm sure that all recognize. This is a famous picture of the Nuremberg medical trial, and on your left is a picture of a very famous paper in bioethics by Todd Chambers, arguing that no comparison, or once you enter the Nazi argument, the discussion ends, what is also known as the Goodwin law. So the refusal of some bioethicists to play the Nazi card is perhaps paradoxically a continuation of the Nuremberg medical trials. The trials aimed at marking a watershed between the evils of the Nazi medicine past and the new page that was to be opened for post-war bioethics. For some, the trials of the German doctors were a milestone in the development of bioethics. Nazi medicine is therefore framed in the bioethics discourse as a deviation from modern Western medicine. The trials labeled Nazi medical crimes as a stand-alone phenomenon which had nothing to do with normative medicine. The historical social backgrounds of Nazi medical practice, their implication to both medical and public health policies, and the scientific theories behind it were pushed off to the side. Post-war bioethics, with the Declaration of the Human Rights in 1947, set the stage for a new moral order centered around individuality, freedom, and self-determination. These values converge with the moral and political agenda of the victorious West. Once liberal bioethics was constituted as the antithesis to Nazi medicine, the next step was to sever all links to pre- and World War II medical practices. It was the epitome of this severance was the refusal to play the Nazi card. It is rather surprising how the Holocaust was almost completely suppressed from post-war bioethical discourse in many countries. To these days, many bioethicists consider the Holocaust to be a silencing factor for a productive bioethical discussion, as we can see by Todd Chambers. This is a paradox, the simultaneous silencing and the dominant factor.
Sorry, I'm just looking at this right, and there is a problem sharing.
I see, okay, I thought that I have no time. We actually speaking about a two-edged discourse in bioethics. One is emphasizing the Holocaust and the Nazi past as a milestone in the development of bioethics. The birth of bioethics is often used to be situated in post-war discourse, and the second side of bioethics is the refusal to draw continuities or similarities or to draw any lesson from the Nazi past. So this paradox we want to claim can be dissolved or perhaps understood or analyzed if we understand bioethics as a form of biopolitics. We want to enter the term and the terminology of biopolitics in order to, let's say, to unearth the apolitical aspect of bioethics and to actually argue that any bioethical discussion always drags with him history and sociology. Biopolitics can be defined as the governmentality of life itself, that is, the practices of control by which state apparatuses construct modern social entities such as the nation and population. According to this definition, the liberal aspiration to separate medicine and public health, as well as medicine or science and politics from power relations, is an illusion. since the individual body and the population are the result of practices of power and are continually embedded in those practices. But what is biopolitics in the context of public health? Following political scientist Robert Esposito, we adopt the term immunitas and communitas to denote public health as a form of biopolitics. Without entering the complexity of these terms, communitas is the term used to refer to the cementing glue that links people together and form a community. This could be also understood in the social psychology as a form of in-group sentiment. Immunitas, on the other hand, represents the need to be protected from others, since the other is considered a risk. In social psychology, this could be termed as an out-group sentiment. Public health, we argue, is caught between these two trajectories. Communitas relates to solidarity and caring, emphasizing health promotion and health education, awareness to social context. Immunitas refers to policy and approach, emphasizing the threat of contagion supporting means such as surveillance, isolation, discipline. We don't need to elaborate more on that, just think of the corona. Esposito argues that biology is the science that grounds Nazi politics, and he quotes Rudolf Hess, who stated that National Socialism is nothing but applied biology. Thus, not only the medical profession is given unprecedented powers and it supports the regime more than any other profession, but the political leadership itself assumes medical biological principle as the guiding criteria of their actions, inscribing the entrance, if I'm sure you are familiar with the inscription in Mauthausen, cleanness is health, which actually epitomized this perspective. So National Socialism took the paradigm of communitas and immunitas to their extremes, to the point in which physical elimination of the other was the way to avoid the contagion of the German folk. The final solution had a biological immunitasian character. Esposito quotes Himmler, who argued anti-Semitism is like disinfection, removing lice is not an ideological question, but a question of hygiene. The fact that National Socialism took the immunitarian paradigm to its extreme, making it the ground for all its politics, explained the centrality of medicine and physician in the National Socialist regime. When politics is reduced to immunity, the political leadership becomes the physician of the polis, since its main tasks are the surveillance of the body politics and protecting it from pathogens through the isolation and elimination of the latter. At the same time, physicians become political leader, yet from a very limited perspective, leaving out the beneficial potential of care and solidarity intrinsic to medicine and public health. This is the theoretical background on how bioethics should understand its past in the National Socialist heritage. And now I'm giving the floor to Professor Davidovich, who will speak on how we think this could be implemented in the history of Israeli public health.
Thank you, Hagai. I want to be very personal. For me, this whole discussion has several layers. First of all, I'm a public health physician. It was probably one of the best choices of my life. On the other hand, I'm totally aware about these immunitas and exclusionary very strong forces that we saw also during COVID, as Hagai mentioned, such lockdowns that maybe we're not prepared as we could, especially from the mental health and the community and the food security perspective. Now, of course, to have lockdowns, it's not Nazi medicine. Okay, so we need to be very careful. But there is something within public health, the connection between public health and the state, okay, that has its own history, and definitely within Nazi medicine, that's something that must be taken into consideration. I want to mention another very important historian that we should bring it to the table, and this is Paul Weindling, that many of you, of course, know. So take his book, for example, Epidemics and Genocide in East Europe. So there is something there in public health that I think, again, as someone who is very proud to be a public health physician, that we must understand the dangers and the humility and the hubris sometimes that unfortunately some public health practitioners have. And here, those who know my work, of course I dealt quite a lot with ringworm irradiation, with all the issue of the 50s. Rona Seidelman is here with us, and she wrote a wonderful book I really recommend you about the gate of immigration, Sha'ar Aliyah, as a quarantine place, and the discussion in the parliament in the 50s, how we can take Holocaust survivors and put them behind barbed wires, and finally, yes, they did. So we need to be very careful, and playing the Nazi card is a tricky business. Unfortunately, some NGOs are taking it both with ringworm and the Yildei Teiman issue, and of course they're playing the Nazi card in a horrible way. But maybe we need to be more empathetic and trying to start a dialogue with them. I'm so sorry that Professor Nachman Ash is not here. He's a really great person, mensch, really, and leading the Ministry of Health, but I participated in the Ministry of Health committee on reducing racism in the healthcare system. Now, it was a great committee. We were talking about prevention and screening and monitoring and interventions. We all agreed that in order to speak about reducing racism in the healthcare system in Israel, because this is an issue that is happening all around the world with its own context and history, we must also talk about the past. And I'm working, that's another layer, I'm working quite a lot on issues of trauma and memory. My wife, Professor Michal Alberstein, that is now was elected Dean of the Law Faculty at Ben-Gurion University, we edited a volume, also together with Rakefet Zalashik that was already mentioned. And sometimes it's hard to see how every kind of community is trying to speak about their trauma, and instead of having a dialogue, it's becoming like a fight, you know, who got the biggest trauma. And of course, the Holocaust always wins, because what you can say about the Holocaust. But maybe in a way, this is not a good idea, because otherwise it can be, as Hagai mentioned, like the Nuremberg trials, and I have people here that wrote about it and are much more expert than I am. What was the role of the Nuremberg trials? What sometimes is the role of bioethics to kind of divide and make things easier. Now, I myself on Facebook was called Dr. Mengele now, because I'm promoting vaccinations. Also, Dr. Shona Roy-Price, the head of the public health services, she's going with bodyguards. So again, you need to be very, very careful when you're dealing with the Nazi card. But saying, you know, people that are traumatized because of the ringworm irradiation, and because they're using Dr. Mengele, okay, so now they are totally ignorant and stupid. I think it's a shame. And I know it's very hard, and I had a discussion with Professor Nachman Ash and also with the Minister of Health, and they're very angry with these people. And I know that there are some historians, and I'm not going to mention the names, that are maybe the first role is just to protect the state. I'm not against the state. I want a strong Ministry of Health, but I think that having some reflection about our past in Israel, by understanding how in Germany, the mecca of medicine and public health, what happened there, and of course we're very, very far from there. And maybe it can never happen again. I don't know. But I think this is too easy to use this kind of explanation. So, as a public health physician, I truly think that we need to take Nazi medicine, and especially, and Volker, you wrote about it, I think with Etienne, how also within, so it's a double exclusion. First of all, how medicine is kind of separated, but then with public health was kind of totally forgotten because the euthanasia project was framed as a public health intervention. Now, it's horrible, of course, an intervention against first also German people, the unfit, using economic arguments, and that's something we're also doing, right, in the health basket discussion. And some people sometimes are also how we can use how a physician can use economic arguments, right? Is it ethical to do so? And probably yes, you must, right? You must make priorities. So I don't have a clear solution, like how to use the Nazi card. But I think that the bottom line, and here I finish because I see my time is over, although we started 5 minutes later, Shmuel. Yeah. Okay. I won't I won't take more time from. So I think that you can take our paper. We are using there, and I think it went under the radar by some Israelis. No, not this community. Because we are saying there are some very provocative things. Mati, you also said that it's very provocative. Shani was one of the students that heard me maybe this presentation many times. So how you can use the Nazi card in an ethical discussion here in Israel, yes, when we have Holocaust survivors, that again were taken under barbed wires in the late 40s, early 50s, and do it in an empathic and sensitive way. I truly think that the Lancet Commission should try to deal with this question. I'm not presenting you now like a recipe how to do it, but I based myself on a very large body of literature already existing, again by people sitting here, that are trying to look on Nazi medicine not as a, this and that, but more as a continuum, and to see the dangers that are inherent maybe in medicine. We didn't discuss research also, that of course is very crucial here. Actually, I met Volker the first time in my life when Volker 20 years ago, you did a conference in Lübeck on human experimentation. And I think that currently the Ministry of Health and the Israeli Medical Association, and I'm sorry that Professor Hagai is not here, I don't think they're taking the easy way. The easy way is to say, oh, the Nazis were horrible, the Jewish physicians were amazing, and we solved the problem. I think it's too simplistic. I mean, what I said is true, but I think it's too simplistic. Of course, the Nazi physicians were horrible, and the Jewish physicians, again, most of them tried to do, and I cannot judge them even, I cannot even imagine myself living there. But I think there are more gray areas that we need to be brave and look at the mirror, including in our history and also in current things. And this is mainly, I think, the bottom line of our paper. Thank you very much. And I'm totally sorry. I need to go to a climate change discussion with the Commission of the President. It's Herzog, and Hagai has another conference, so we'll be staying for a few more minutes, and I'm so sorry. And thank you so much for what you're doing. It's so important, and sorry that I'm saying also that thank Ben-Gurion University and the faculty that is, as was mentioned by Mati, is really taking it very, very seriously. I think it's something that is part of our identity. Thank you.
So, thank you. Our time doesn't provide for questions at this point. But again, with students here, please take note. If you recall, yesterday we spoke about one of the Commission's goals was one of them was to form a enlightened physician as an agent of change, of social change, and you just saw an example of that. So thank you, Nadav, for your leadership in demonstrating how physicians can be enlightened agents of social change and fulfilling both our school's charter, BGU, and the vision and the charter that we're trying to establish at the Lancet Commission. Next on this session will be Dr. David Deutsch, PhD from Sociology and Anthropology from BGU University. He currently teaches Holocaust and religion at Haifa University and is researching in Yad Vashem at the Yad Vashem School under the desk of the Asia and Africa Studies. He'll be giving us a lecture on models of empathetic violence in Nazi euthanasia. David Deutsch, the floor is yours.
Hello. I'm the head desk of Asian Africa section at the International School for Holocaust Studies, which means what I do is outreach. Now, just a comment before I begin with something a bit more controversial is that one of the, I would say, the three topics that I see work with my colleagues in what wrongfully is called developing countries, but mainly countries that are not directly related to the Jewish Holocaust stories, is sexual violence, the issue of trauma, and eugenics. Those three topics are topics that I don't have to ask through them why is the Holocaust relevant. It just opens doors with colleagues, whether it be in Japan, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Vietnam, in all of those places that I've conducted seminars. So that's why I see Lancet Commission and the connection between Holocaust, genocide, eugenics, serving both sides of the story, sort of Martin Buber's idea of knocking two stones against each other. And now my controversial remark that will also sort of direct what we're going to say. I took my daughter, it was years ago, to a doctor. And when I wasn't there, I went out and he gave her a vaccine for, I don't even remember what, it wasn't the mandatory vaccine. And he told me after it happened. I was furious. I went to complain. I complained about that doctor. It reached high levels, and he apparently was the head of a department, and he said, this is the first time anyone complains about me. And then I asked him, but you didn't tell me. You didn't tell me you're giving your vaccine. I deserve to have that knowledge. He says, everyone gets it. It's for their benefit. Story part one. Part two, I read the verdict of Justice Holmes from the mid-20s, where he says, he uses what the anti-vaxxers do today, but the other way around. He says, if we can mandate vaccines, we can mandate sterilization. That kind of link. And when I add those two together, a question arises that directed the research that I'm going to talk about. Immer mit Liebe, always with love. This is the title of article from 1965 after a trial of the perpetrators from the Oberwalde Meseritz asylum, and the nurses were there, and the reporter is grappling with the idea, how could these nurses that are raised within 75% of them with a Christian gnade, caritas, very empathic, oriented medical ethics field, how can they do these heinous crimes? Now, close reading of that question has an assumption. The assumption of the reporter is that these don't exclude each other. Meaning, when he saw those women put to trial, he saw their kindness, their empathy. He doesn't say this is a facade, this is cynical. He says, how can those two things coexist? And I think one of the things that I have a feeling that is a bit of a blind spot in Holocaust, in the junction of Holocaust research, medical ethics, eugenics, is the role of empathy. Now, empathy, as soon as I say it, usually is located semantically on the sunny side of normative thought, meaning we always think of it as a good thing. Now, of course, there are researches that deal with limiting the empathy that doesn't override each other. I know that in psychology, there's a lot of researches that talk about like the prism of empathy. However, one of the things that Leo Agosta, which is a researcher, that shows the relationship between empathy and violence. And he looks at it from the perspective of torturer and torturee. That in order for the torturer to torture, he must study his recipient. He must see him in his or her shoe steps. He must walk in his place. Now, empathy, the word and I believe also the emotion, same way as intimacy and many things that come from history of emotions, are new concepts. We understand ourselves differently in the 19th and 20th century. And like many of these emotional concepts, they don't come from psychology or from emotions, they come from art, literature, and the specific idea of empathy, and this is important for the rest of my argument to clarify actually what it means. It actually derived from aesthetics, from the idea of empathic outlook, meaning not how I observe a photograph or a painting, but how does the painting observe me? The view of the painting on me is an empathic outlook. That's where it came from, and then in emotions, it grew like fire in, it just grew more and more into different disciplines and different fields. Eugenics wasn't immune from that, meaning part of the pro-eugenic, pro-sterilization, later pro-euthanasia argumentation does not only stem from public health, state interest, those branches of argumentation. They also stem from the branch of argumentation of this is for their good, an argumentation that was less researched. Now, this is an Easter egg here about why did I put Gerhard Richter's photo-based paintings on an Immer mit Liebe, but this maybe I'll address at the end. I'll just say that this is Werner Heide, the head of T4, and this is a photo-based that Gerhard Richter had in his living room, and this I think he had in his kitchen. And this is Aunt Marine, which was killed in euthanasia. And he did both photo-based paintings. And he puts them one next to the other in his home. Maybe I'll address that later. So as early on, we see two branches of arguments when we look at eugenic argumentation, later leading up to sterilization and euthanasia. Early on, we see in the Binding and Hoche writings the thing that we all know well. What we all know well, I assume, there are two ways to sort of justify it. One would be to downplay the subject. He's not enough of a subject to be a recipient of medical health. He's inhuman. Who create fearsome and counter image of true humanity, it rose horror in nearly everyone who meets them. That's one humanization. Similar, let's say, to the anti-Semitic, anti-minority propaganda, etc. Costly, of course, always. They cost so much. You see Nazi propaganda in the 30s. Everything is how much marks it cost, and everything has to do with how much they cost, and they're taking away from the healthy as well. However, they're also dealing with the question of sympathy. They have to answer that question. Now, the way they answer changes over time, but they say it is wrong to act towards them from a standpoint of sympathy, but there's an expression in Hebrew, in Aramaic, it says havamina, what you would have thought. And what you would have thought is, of course, you have to apply sympathy to them, but you shouldn't because they're not human enough. Now, this argument changes, but they're always dealing with the question of we are caregivers. Empathy is part of our tradition. And let's say another thing, maybe pose it as a question later that I'll answer. Most of these facilitators of euthanasia and of sterilization came from the medical field. Can a person one morning take off his ideological standpoint, his heritage, and just change it? What I argue is no. There has to be some kind of combinations of their understanding of medical ethics along with Nazi ideology. In other words, what I will show is that empathy served as a mediating tool, not only to diminish the radicalization of violence, but to enable it without the self-criticism. It became the rationale, a form of justification. If we continue on, maybe to exemplify that, I'll show you two films. One is from 1935-36. It came out, I think, in February 36, Prague. And both are Nazi propaganda films. And the other is from 1941, Ich klage an. One deals with showing the mentally ill, and you will see the two themes of they're non-human and they're costly, and the other, after euthanasia was already in practice, which method do they use to convince? So let's begin with the first, just briefly. Okay, the second part, there's also a first part. I'm going to give no more than 30 seconds of this because you'll get the idea. The way the camera's located on their face. the way it's edited and cut. Texts that entail how costly they are, how they come on at the expense of other Germans. And this movie goes on. The basic idea you could see more and more. It is in Berlin. I do know that many, at least that's what the Nazi Party says. Many people went to see it. The basic idea is very simple. They're costly. They're not exactly human. They're not exactly like you. I think that's a bit of a simplistic argument. And okay, I'm going to say an uncountable sentence, okay, and then retract. Is it enough? Is this argument enough to kill your own patient? Is this ideology of they're costly and they're not exactly human? With this, it actually contradicts the caregiver's initial perception. What would work? What would work when you have to justify not only sterilization, but you have to justify it a step further? And in a way, what I found out that empathic reasoning works better with radicalization. I do not want to be essential, which means I'm using this as an analytic tool and not as an integral tool. And this is important for me to note. This is not something that everyone had an empathic outlook. But look at the film and look at the argument. The film, oh, not this one. Sorry, this one. The film is about minute number 2, is a woman, and she has a terminal illness, and she is asking her doctor for a request. But through that request, she is manifesting Nazi ideology, which is pro-euthanasia at this point. She is voicing the voiceless. She is voicing the disabled. She is voicing supposedly those who don't have a voice and cannot say, please, sorry for the sentence, please euthanize me. But she's saying that. And let's hear exactly this manifest.
Beine sind schon gelähmt. Linke Arm, das ganze rechte sind auch lang, nicht wahr? Du, ich fürchte mich nicht vor dem Tod, aber ich will dich immer so belustigen. Ja, überhaupt kein Mensch mehr. Nur noch ein Fleischstumpf. Und so mal eine Qualwechsel vorbei. Und wenn dann an mich denken wird, wenn ich dann tot bin, dann wird er froh sein. Und das will ich nicht. Ich will es nicht. Du bist doch mein bester Freund.
Das denke ich immer.
Dann vergisst du die Medizinflasche wegzunehmen.
Sie verrückt. So krank bist du doch bestimmt nicht.
Versprich es mir, dass du mir hilfst, wenn ich es noch werde. Versprich es mir. Das ist kümmert und mir Spaß.
Und hör mir mal zu.
Du weißt, ich bin euer bester Freund. Und außerdem Arzt. Ein Arzt ist ein Diener des Lebens. Das muss er erhalten um jeden Preis.
Darf man den Tod aufhalten, wenn er es kann?
Natürlich kann
Aber verkürzen. Darf er die Qual des Todes nicht?
er. Nein,
Warum nicht?
weil wir nicht wissen.
You don't have to argue for, because the argument already is done through the dialogue. And I think this is in tune with actual reports of doctors and nurses of those years, when they try to explain why they did what they did, and they try to implement it. This is part of their reasoning. Now, despite the fact that, okay, also newspapers, one last comment, newspapers. I had like a research assistant that went through all of 2 Nazi newspapers, Das Reich and Der Angriff, from 1933 until 1943 or something like that. And her job was simple. She had to see how many articles are about mentally disabled during those years. The general idea is 1933 from June until Sterilization Act 1934, a lot. 1934 until 1938, less, but still exists once in a while. there's silence. After 1939, and it's different to other forms of persecution. If you compare to the Jewish one, to the one against the Roma, to the one, they're always dehumanizing. They're silent. However, the discourse sort of pops up with the professional discourse of doctors and nurses, zooming in the same way I think Browning did, sort of, onto their discourse. What do they intimately say? And so we see that shift, I think, of using more empathy as reasoning in film, in media, and in professional discourse of doctors and nurses, which will be my next thing. And this is despite the fact that both in academic analysis and in the media, newspapers, and even the justice system refused to see the empathic argument as an argument. Meaning when Hilde Wernicke argued that she killed her patient, she doesn't say she didn't kill him. Out of empathy, the judge refuses to accept her argument, stating that she did not select her victims because of human empathy, compassion, or any of those reasons at all. What if she did? I'm asking that judge, what if she did? What if she killed him because she was empathic? Did that diminish anything of her guilt? Does that diminish anything of her action? Now, the German judicial system went through a few stages there that in different stages, intent was a category, and in different stages it wasn't. But regardless of that, the mere fact that the judge thinks that if she had empathy, that takes away an aspect of the violent action she had done, shows how we see empathy in always a positive way, in a purely positive way. And by the way, the judge is mistaken here, but I went and I saw the protocols behind the trial. He's misinterpreting what she said. That's not something I go into, but because of his inability to see that really she, I wouldn't say means it, because I do not know what in a person's heart. However, I can tell out of context where he says what are his explicit intentions. So this was usually not so much seen in research, despite the fact that when you go into the cases themselves, let's see how long I have. Okay, a couple more, 10 more minutes, so we could really go into several cases. So when we go into the cases themselves, we see that it played a certain role to some degree. Now, a methodological comment. This text over here is taken out of an affidavit, right? So you would assume an affidavit is in order for you to for acquittal, right? You don't want to be, but Werner Heide specifically in his affidavit actually, how should I say it? He implements himself many times. He writes an affidavit over 100 pages long, and he kills himself at the end. I do not see his affidavit as an affidavit, but rather as sort of a form of confession. You see by the writing, he writes there 3 pages about him being gay in his years when he was 16 to 17. It really does not look like other affidavits. And that's why I see what he says, I carry no guilt, and he explains everything he did actually. In other words, the way I see it, he's really trying to explain to his lawyer, to the future, to me, reading this, why he did what he did. And his argument is, I felt that the existence of these absolutely hopeless ill people was meaningless and worthless. I do not mean by their outer conditions, but simply beneath human dignity. And this is important. The thing that defines the meaning of an individual human being was destroyed hopelessly. I know what that thing is, because in another place in his testimony he says that the essence of a human, he takes a Germanic idea of body and soul. He says there's a connection between body and soul. And these people, it's severed. That means they're not human. There are different forms of sort of ways in which they define them as inhuman. This is one of them. I came to the thought that if you see this in a human way, it would be a salvation for those people that do not live anymore. He's supposedly doing it for their benefit. And the other is from Paul Nietzsche, who replaced him in 1941. And these are all connected, all of these. And Paul Nietzsche says, I know for sure that Heide, who was a very soft person, had the same opinion on the decision of euthanasia as I had, which is following, we really saw it from the patient's perspective. That's important. We see this also in testimony. I saw it also in testimonies of nurses, that they said, be it not for me. One nurse says, if I wouldn't be able to step in the shoes of my patients and think of that's what I want to be done to me, I wouldn't be able to do it. So we see arguments like that appear there. We can also see arguments like Walter Schmidt, the child was lying in his own. What I did here, by the way, I want to explain, this is high ranking, mid-level, low ranking. I wanted to show that this argument goes through different ranks of Nazi euthanasia facilitators, all medical staffs. And what he says is, at this time, Dr. Hefferman came once and introduced me to such a child that was lying in his own urine. He said this would be an example for euthanasia, which made sense to me. That's such an important sentence, which made sense to me. I like close reading. And I found that word, which made sense to me, appear in other testimonies. There's a moment of realization, of yes, now I understand why this could work. And usually the moment of realization is not a moment when they understand how much they cost. It's a moment when they say, okay, I understand why this is important. I understand why it's in their benefit. That made sense to me that they say, whether it's nurses or doctors, is usually linked with an empathic argument, the moment of clarity, so to speak. I gave this lecture once, and I had a speaker in the crowd saying, but I could understand them. And I like that comment a lot, because that's the purpose of this lecture, and that's the purpose of this presentation. And I had a point where I was reading through the Werner Heide document, and I was more with him than outside of him. You know, I was really understanding where he's coming from. He's explaining what he sees day after day. Now, I of course, I don't justify it, but I think, and that's why I began with my story. I think that if you tackle this issue from a human emotion kind of reality, where emotions do not operate as singular linear ideas, but rather as networks that could include both help and violence. Empathy, by definition, does not exclude the prospect of violence. It never did, but on the spectrum, it's one of the most elusive emotions that there is, due to the simple fact that in empathy, there's a power structure, always. When you're a doctor in front of your patient and you care about whatever you care about, you have the power. You don't have to abuse it. But the fact that you always have that power makes it more prone to abuse, makes the importance of such research is so crucial to have these. We could talk also about reflectivity about it, but that may be later. And we see two other forms. We have another 4 minutes, so I'll speak for another 2 and then concluding comments. So we see two other forms of how empathy showed its way in. This is a more conservative one. There are many researchers that deal with the difference between Vorsorge and Fürsorge, which actually is whether you're caring for the individual or for the state. And empathy should be applicable, but not only for the subject, but for the nation as an organic body. So that was sort of one of the combinations of empathy. And the other was in the executions themselves, which means not only in theory, but also the practice was so hard for them that, as Anna Gessler says back here, she says she caresses them during the executions. Eugen Stelle says that he sees them and they were calmer. You could see the following text, they should not suffer unnecessarily. I thought it would be better give them a shot rather than the bitter. And the other one, he says, after a few minutes, lying there on the bench with peaceful and relaxed faces when they're dead. They don't suffer anymore. Meaning it's part of the execution itself also carries a tendency of that form of justification. And maybe if we're already in this aspect, I said a lot of these argumentations also came from the Christian combination of medical ethics, Christianity, Nazi ideology, and even the name Yad Vashem was used by Professor Franz Keller, but in a different context before it was invented here. Maybe I'll end with that. He said, he said that those people that self-sterilize, that go willingly, and the context of Yad Vashem is those who can't have kids, right? Those who can't have kids, God promises them, I'll remember you. So he says, those who sterilize themselves, therefore, won't be remembered by their kids. God promises them, I'll give you a Yad Vashem. I'll remember you. That is a use of the word Yad Vashem long before, not long before, but early Nazi days when this kind of combination was tried to be made between the German Christian ideas of Gnade, Caritas, and help, and with Nazi ideology. To sum it up, I think that one of the things that this research can show and demonstrate is the fact that two things. As far as ideology is never fixated. It is an adaptive, evolutionary thing that works with ideas and societies and changes over time, and we see how Nazi ideology sort of shifted itself. And second, also, the approach towards medical staffs that are killing and to medical professionals should be different to the research on SS. In other words, what I was looking for is how do they make that combination, that sort of compromise, the negotiation between their background as medical staffs and their need and their compliance with Nazi values and policies. And what I've noticed is that one of those elements, along with others, you see in research, by the way, where was research? Here. In the bottom one, you see in research there are many other elements, but along with others, this was undermined, and this is what I wanted to sort of demonstrate. Okay, thank you very much. Okay. So, I think that's, is there questions or?
We should be, unfortunately, we cannot allow for a question, but I'm sure everybody is going to grab you in the.
I'll send my
break
email.
And then over lunch. I just want to say one thing because what you just presented to us, which is transformative in a way, it's so important and it's very much time with what we are doing in the commission. We were asking ourselves, the Nazis had ethics, the Nazis had professionalism, the Nazis had professional identity formation that resulted in what it resulted. We are in medical education promote exactly the same thing. Now you added empathy to this. And the crux of what we would like the Commission's report and impact to be is how do you make sure empathy, professionalism, ethics, professional identity formation will not be distorted the way it happened to the Nazis.
Am I, should I answer that? Because okay, my first hat, the truth is my first hat is education. My first hat is education before Holocaust. I always say that when I do Holocaust education, I say I'm first of all educator. And if I don't need to say one word about Holocaust, I won't. And it's important because you can't, in any combination of Holocaust and education, or any combination that goes with education, education comes first. Saying that, I think that one of the things that I find important, and as far as that is, especially with empathy, is to notice the limits of your perception, to be able to give the place of not knowing a significant and ongoing aspect of, one of the things that even bother me in the discourse, all of the, let's call it professional medical ethics versus public knowledge. There's always a Foucaultian feeling on the recipient of that side that there's a lack of fundamental respect to the fact you don't know everything, to the fact that, by definition, the histories of medical progress had just as many loopholes, immoralities as progresses. It's the same way we tend to sugarcoat or silver line liberalism and other things, and we isolate those aspects of history to make it comfortable, and we create taboos around others. And I think one of the important things is the same way with education. I tell every group, learn about your own wrongdoings. Meaning, if you come from the medical field, don't learn learn about the medical field's wrongdoing. I say that about I don't want to be fired, so everyone has to just as much, I think, let's talk about Americans. I think in their curriculum, they should be dealing with the way they treat indigenous people. And I think the medical field as well, one of the things that could create you can never prevent violence in that aspect. There will always be a doctor that overrides the rights of his patient. However, if you want to attempt to it, I think education regarding the flaws and what were the reasons for it, bravely, like the discussions that are going on to here, can minimize it. Will never prevent it, but can take it down a notch. And I think this is not only true for the medical field, it's true for any professional field that has some kind of power and authority. Like statesmen know it, right? They all know that nationalism could take 2 steps further. But in a way, the semantic legitimacy hovering over medical professionals is a bit more acceptable, is a bit more, and therefore I think that would be counterbalance, in my really humble and unknowledgeable opinion as far as that. So thank you for the question.